All right, AP World History students, welcome back for one of our final lectures here on topic 9.4, which is economics in the global age. All right. These are the learning objectives and key concepts or historical developments. We want to be able to explain the continuities and changes in the global economy during the 20th century and into the 21st. We want to know about what the free market is, what we mean by policies of economic liberalization that follow the Cold War. We want to examine some of the revolutions in information and communications technology that led to the growth of knowledge economies and what exactly knowledge economies are. We're going to look at how manufacturing and industrial production shifted to other parts of the world, as some of us are well aware, to parts of Asia or Latin America, right? Think of how many things are made in China or Mexico or Honduras. And then finally, we'll conclude by looking at new economic institutions, some of them continuities from earlier eras like multinational corporations, some of them expansions and kind of new changes like regional trade agreements such as NAFTA. So let's jump into it and get started. All right, starting with the growth of free market economies and by defining a couple terms such as globalization. A definition you might find something pretty close to in a dictionary for globalization is the interaction kind of among or between different peoples or cultures, between different governments or companies and corporations around the world, right? Sort of interaction taking place across the globe between cultures, between economies, between countries is one way to kind of think about globalization, all right? The globe interacting. Another way is we can kind of talk about it as a process, right? The process through which culture or business or governing is made global is another way to sort of use that term globalization. But more typically, when you hear people speak about globalization, they're often referring to the increasing interconnectedness and integration of the global economy, right? They almost always talk about globalization in an economic sense. We're going to talk about it in both the cultural sense and an economic sense, but we'll save culture for another lecture. Economic change in the 20th century was facilitated by a couple things, okay, that helped lead to these policies of liberalization, okay? And we should say that as we use this term, economic liberalization, we are talking about economic liberalization, right? Not political, right? So you will hear that word liberal sometimes, and it means a whole set of things when you're talking about it politically or socially. It means a whole other set of things when you're talking about it economically, all right? And that's what we're going to be trying to explain here a little bit. First of all, a lot of the liberalization and free market changes are facilitated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, right, which had been this socialist superpower counterweight to capitalist dominance. With the Soviet Union out of the way, there was no obstacle to a kind of global capitalist integration, right? With the fall of the Soviet Union, all of the countries of the Eastern Bloc were sort of liberated from Soviet control and were now able to trade freely with capitalist democracies, kind of throughout the 90s and continuing into today. Additionally, countries, some of the non-aligned countries like India and then others that were U.S. or Soviet allies that had been pursuing policies of kind of economic self-sufficiency began to sort of relax their restrictions on imports and international trade and to engage in an export-based international trade model to developing their country and economy, starting in the 90s for a lot of these countries. Economic liberalization is, sort of the cornerstone of some of the policies of world leaders from the 80s and early 90s, like Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Britain, who were strong advocates for free markets, right? Markets built around supply and demand, as opposed to like a command economy where the government, is sort of telling companies how much, to produce, telling farmers how much to produce and what kinds of crops. We need this much corn, this much wheat this year. We need X amount of shoes or televisions or something, right? A free market is supply and demand, right? Consumers and businesses are going to sort of, through supply and demand, reason out prices and quantity and quality without a lot of government control or regulation. The policies of Ronald Reagan that contribute to the growth of kind of free markets or attempt to are known as Reaganomics, all right? And I'll speak about this briefly, but really I intend for you guys to click on the link that you can see there and watch the video on Reaganomics and add to your notes based off of that video, all right? During the time of Reagan's presidency, the country was experiencing in the early 80s something known as stagflation, okay, which is when you have sort of high rates of inflation coupled with high unemployment, as well as a sort of stagnant period of growth, right? Stagnant demand for new products. And so it's kind of like a not a great economic situation. Ronald Reagan was an advocate of what has become known as sort of trickle-down theory. This idea that if taxes could be cut for the rich, if capital gains taxes could be reduced, government regulations could be reduced, the people at the top and the richest and most powerful companies and individuals would be able to save more money that they could then invest into innovation and opening new factories and expanding the market. And so in a sense that by giving benefits and economic breaks to the wealthiest in a country, those benefits would sort of trickle down to the majority of people in that economy. All right? And there's all kinds of criticisms to trickle-down economics from the opposition, that it leads to, huge amounts of growth and wealth for the rich and doesn't, in fact, really trickle down to the people at the bottom, right? The debate on that continues, right? You'll have to watch the video to get a couple more details on that. Ronald Reagan, in an attempt to sort of improve the free market situation of the economy, pursued policies of deregulation, right? Various regulations that were imposed on businesses, such as, maybe environmental standards, or when it came to the stock market, some of the kind of more risky things that they hadn't been allowed to do were opened up to them. Things like privatization, taking publicly owned companies or industries or utilities and privatizing them, right? Giving them to a private company to take care of. Some job that the government used to do being handed off to a for-profit company, the idea being that they're going to be doing it more efficiently. When I was in the Army, I saw this a lot, right? It had been that the Army itself kind of oversaw the military housing on base, right? But in the time that I was in, that all became privatized. It was handled by local rental companies and things like that. Again, the idea being that it was going to be cheaper for the government, cheaper for the soldiers and things like that. Although, again, the debate goes on if that's exactly how it worked out or not. Another part of this was reducing benefits, right? Was to sort of, beyond just kind of reducing government regulation, reduce the amount of federal spending, right? So not spending as much money on welfare programs or Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or things like that, right? To reduce government spending because, in a sense, part of that had to do with reducing taxes on the wealthy, right? The tax rate goes from something like 70% on the richest Americans before Ronald Reagan to a little over 25% after Reagan's presidency. Okay, so dramatic, like monumental reductions in the tax rate on the richest, wealthiest Americans. And the proponents of Reaganomics talk about how this led to recovery, right? That this brought us out of the recession that the country had been in. Critics say, given enough time, we probably would have come out of that recession anyway, right, given the business cycle, and that these policies of reducing taxes on the wealthy, deregulating things, reducing benefits, led to more deficit, more debt, as huge amounts of revenue were lost in tax revenue. And that in general, these policies favored the rich over the majority of people in the country. So in the United States, this is still a big debate between, Democrat and Republican teams that disagree on the legacy of Reaganomics, right? Was it a good thing? Did it help the economy? Was it a bad thing? Did it hurt the economy and add to the debt? Watch the video and figure out how you feel about it there, right? To see some examples of this, though, kind of in action, let's look at a few places. So in Chile, we had last talked about Chile as an example of a center of the Cold War, right? Where in 1973, Augusto Pinochet had taken power in a U.S.-backed coup against the democratically elected but socialist Salvador Allende on the left here, and Augusto Pinochet is the soldier-looking guy on the right here. Pinochet would rule Chile from 1974 until 1990, when he was democratically ousted by a vote of citizens, right? By a kind of referendum or plebiscite of people that were opposed to Pinochet's violent, repressive methods, right? This guy was a dictator and executed people in large numbers, tortured people for being, suspected socialists or things like that. And the people eventually got fed up with this and voted him out, right? But there's a couple important things kind of wrapped up in that. One is that during Pinochet's time in power, he restructured the economy from a bunch of state-run industries, nationalized industries, right, that were run by the government of Chile, to privatized companies, right, and sweeping policies of economic liberalization that have made, according to a lot of different economists, that have made Chile one of the most economically liberal, or economically open and free market countries in the Western Hemisphere, even more so than the United States. This deregulation, privatization led to impressive economic growth, but a great deal of inequality as well. Okay, but we do have this example where opening up the economy to these liberalization policies, some people argue, led to a more democratic society, right? That eventually got this dictator not even overthrown, but voted out, right? Led to a situation where he asked the people, let's do a vote. Do you want to continue this dictatorship or start having democratic elections? And the people voted to get rid of this guy and pursue a democratically elected government. And it's thought that these economic policies are in part what led to that, all right? Now, it's not all sunshine and roses in Chile today. I encourage you to click on this link as well on the impressive economic growth but increased inequality to see that there are protests going on in Chile right now about the inequality that has grown, right? The gap between the rich and the poor that has grown in that country, in part due to these policies of Pinochet as well. Another place we can look at as an example of economic reform and liberalization is in China. All right? In 1981, Deng Xiaoping, one of the great leaders and reformers in Chinese history, shifted the focus from economic equality to a policy of economic growth. All right? And he pursued this by doing some things that made China from a shining sort of example of totalitarian style communism or socialism to a place that looks very capitalist, right? Very totalitarian and oppressive still, but looks very capitalist and in a lot of ways doesn't look communist at all, right? For example, he replaced the communes and collectives that peasants had been put onto under the rule of Mao Zedong with peasant leased plots of land, right, where farmers could grow crops and sell a portion on the market as if they were, private farmers in business for themselves, although a portion of the crops they still had to surrender to the government. But this incentivized farmers to be as efficient and effective as they could, right? The greater a surplus that they had, the more profit they could make for themselves, right? And that profit motive is a strong one for people. And this leads to agricultural surpluses for China, which had in decades before Deng Xiaoping dealt with famines from time to time. And those days were gone. Deng Xiaoping encouraged factories to produce more consumer goods, right? To shift away from producing military equipment and industrial equipment and produce more consumer goods, right? More purses and handbags, more televisions and radios, more makeup or baseballs and footballs or whatever it was, right? And he sort of encourages these factory managers to, he tells them to try and make profit as if they were factory owners, right? Which in a lot of cases, these factories were still owned by the state. But he says, try to make profit in this factory as if you were the owner, right? As if you were going to reap those profits. Probably most importantly is China creates these areas known as special economic zones in China, or more briefly as SEZs. An SEZ is an area, sometimes just a city, right, that is designated with certain rules and laws that are meant to attract foreign investment and foreign businesses to do business and operations in your country, right? So they might be areas where you lower the taxes, where you lower environmental regulations, or where you lower labor regulations, right? Say the workers in this area aren't allowed to go on strike, or things like that. So that these special economic zones do in fact end up attracting a lot of foreign investment. Think about, for example, Apple, who has, their headquarters in the United States, but has all their equipment, basically, their cell phones, iPhones, assembled in China, right? And then sold into a global market. China has done very well with these SEZs in attracting billions and billions of dollars of foreign investment. Deng Xiaoping additionally reopened the Shanghai stock market, allowed private ownership for some businesses, not all. Some of China's largest businesses are still state-run enterprises. The big difference here is that these economic reforms in China did not lead to a more democratic society, right? Even though people were, in some cases, more democratically minded, when large protests did manage to come together asking for democratic reform in 1989, this led to what we know as the Tiananmen Square massacre in Beijing, where in the large public square of Tiananmen Square, students protesting in part for democratic reforms, more say in government, right, less hostility, were massacred by soldiers, by tanks, and hundreds to maybe thousands of people were killed to clear this square and stamp down on any hint of a demand for democracy. China's economic growth continues today, right? They continue to surge upward, and their economy has grown, faster than just about any economy ever in world history, right? From a place that was very impoverished and dominated by its neighbors and faraway foreign powers like Britain and nearby people like Japan. If you think about the age of imperialism and how the Qing dynasty ended, that's very clear in your mind, to the second largest economy and one of the emerging superpowers of the world today, right? So even though that economy continues to grow and their wealth and power continues to grow, as you can see a little bit more about in the link that I've posted for you there, consistent criticism is of China's human rights record, which beyond Tiananmen Square continues in acts of brutality against its own people, the Uyghur Muslim people of Western China being one of the more recent examples. So this brings us to an example of economic change in the 20th century, the growth of what are known as knowledge economies, all right? So various advances in communications and information technology, like you maybe saw in the Heimler videos for 9.1, things like phones, fax machines back in the day, the internet, computers, etc., led countries to pursue a new kind of economy beyond the traditional kind of agricultural or industrial or service-based economies, a knowledge economy. All right? In a knowledge-based economy, people are creating, distributing, and using knowledge and information as their product, right? As what they are selling. It employs designers, right? Engineers, software designers, software engineers, computer engineers, mechanical engineers, teachers, professors, universities are all sort of engaged and employed in knowledge economy endeavors, right? A good example in the United States would be Silicon Valley, where workers, for various companies, Apple or Google or Tesla, whoever's located out there, are using their knowledge to create ways for others to communicate or collaborate or innovate, and creating these new solutions for things that are born out of their knowledge, right? Out of education and investments in educational infrastructure, in human resources, right? Your educated population, instead of material resources like coal or iron or things that might be important for an industrial economy. A knowledge economy is all about investments in your education infrastructure and having an educated populace that is able to invent and innovate and connect the world. Like, Google or, Airbnb or Amazon or, some of these companies have been able to do. So some examples here outside of Silicon Valley of knowledge economies and places that were able to grow because of knowledge economies. One would be Finland, all right, which was a very agrarian economy up until the 1950s, until right after World War II. After World War II, like a lot of other European countries, taking advantage of the Marshall Plan and, the foreign investment of American money, intensively pursued industrialization after World War II, with the Soviet Union as a major customer of theirs. The Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc is where a lot of the manufactured goods from post-World War II Finland were going. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, Finland faced an economic crisis as it lost its, largest customer for a lot of its manufactured goods. And throughout the 1990s, they were forced into a situation where, like others, they began to pursue a new approach focused on international trade and a knowledge economy to get themselves back on track, all right? By making heavy investments in education and research and development, by establishing a science and technology policy council to help them innovate, growth strategies focused on technology and innovation, they began to experience gigantic economic growth through leading the development in mobile phones and software development related to that. The multinational corporation Nokia, if you're familiar with Nokia and their phones, which are a little bit more popular back in the day in the 2000s and so on than they are now. But this is one of the largest and best examples of a multinational company based around kind of a knowledge economy, right? Through innovation and the ability to design, manufacture, and market these technological devices, all right? So companies like Nokia are the first to kind of shift to these technological industries in Finland. And these industries required these very highly educated workers and were able to take advantage of a globalizing world to, have the sort of design and marketing and innovation side of the cell phone or pager or computer industry done at their headquarters in Finland, and are able to outsource the production and manufacturing part of these cell phones, like Apple does today, to the lower wage parts of the world. But the big idea here is that as a knowledge economy, investing in education and technology is what helped Finland's economy recover from its kind of industrial collapse after the fall of the Soviet Union. With Japan, another example, right? They call Japan an economic miracle, right, in the post-World War II landscape. You will sometimes hear historians refer to that, the Japanese economic miracle. Following World War II, Japan implemented policies of self-sufficiency, but things that we would consider very similar to mercantilism, or in the modern day we would call this protectionism. Japan had policies where they were trying to maximize their exports and minimize their imports, right? Very mercantilist, if you remember the details of that. How did they do this, right? How do they maximize their exports, minimize their imports? Well, first of all, the corporations of Japan were heavily subsidized, heavily supported by the government, right? Given, money sometimes in certain cases to help them keep their costs low. This allowed them to outcompete people in a global marketplace, right? Kept Japanese goods artificially low cost. They also had very high tariffs on imports to discourage the buying of foreign goods and encourage the buying of local Japanese goods, to sort of build up their local internal economy in the days after World War II. They invest heavily in their education. Japanese education is, again, one of those that are kind of renowned in the world today. And they leveraged the, at the time, low-wage workforce that they had into building this export-oriented manufacturing giant, right? That had this, export-focused economy trying to minimize any imports from foreign countries, all right? But over time, an increase in international pressure for Japan to sort of open its economy up, to allow foreign investment and imports into Japan, as well as Japanese labor unions demanding higher wages and more benefits, forced Japan to sort of diverse its economy into the knowledge sectors and information technology areas, into finance and international banking, so that today Japan is, again, one of these centers of innovation and invention, and has a large sector of its economy devoted to the knowledge and information-based technology economy. In addition to being huge, international bankers and financiers. For example, we often think of our national debt as, a lot of it belonging to China, which is not really the case. Only about 5.5% of all of our trillions of dollars of debt is owned by China, has been lent to us by China, and an almost equal amount, and sometimes higher amount, has been lent to us by Japan, right? Japan is often our second or third largest creditor, right? Of countries that loan us money, Japan is way up there, all right? So they're very powerful, very wealthy, although there's a big drop from the second position of China to Japan, right? Other countries that have followed Japan's path of going from an kind of self-sufficiency mercantilist model of exporting things but trying to minimize imports and so on, and using low-wage manufacturing labor to grow wealth in your country, and then kind of transitioning to these knowledge-based high-tech industry kind of companies like Japan did, there's four other countries that are known as the four Asian tigers: Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Hong Kong, I guess, being more like a city. That all experience similar stories to Japan, following a similar kind of method. All right. Now moving to an economic continuity, something that has stayed the same over the last century or two, is the shift of manufacturing from areas where it is being traditionally done to areas that can do it cheaper. All right. As the knowledge and service economies of wealthy countries continued to grow in the United States and other places, the manufacturing and industry parts of the economy gradually declined. And this is something that we know as deindustrialization. All right. What ends up happening is that as the sort of wealth of a country grows, the standard of living grows, the wages and strength of unions grow, manufacturing and industrial centers will often relocate to regions that have low wage labor, few labor regulations like minimum wage laws or child labor laws, things like that, to places that have really relaxed and not enforced environmental regulations, right, where you're allowed to pollute a little bit more or dispose of your waste in a maybe not so ethical way. This is where a lot of industries from the United States or from Europe kind of relocate to East Asia, right? China or South Korea, Taiwan, some of those places in the 80s and 90s. Nowadays, you see a lot of business going to Vietnam and Bangladesh, to Mexico and other places, depending on a number of factors. But the result of this is, like I said, something known as deindustrialization. Deindustrialization is that process. It is when a place becomes deindustrialized, when the industries and factories leave one area for another area, usually a foreign country. The effect on the United States has been the creation of what's known as the Rust Belt, that replaced what used to be known as the manufacturing belt. This is the area around the Great Lakes that's now called the Rust Belt because of all the abandoned factories and industrial buildings that are there, right? And the effects on places like Detroit, Chicago have been monumental. There's been huge increases in unemployment and poverty as these really good factory jobs disappeared, right? People that made $30, $40, $50 an hour, had healthcare benefits, had time off, vacations, etc. Those jobs that our parents or grandparents had disappear, and they go overseas, right? They go to China, they go to Mexico, they go to Vietnam, to Bangladesh to take advantage of low wages, low labor regulations, and lax environmental regulation. For these countries, though, it has given them a little bit of a boost to their economy, right? In Bangladesh, village-sized factories owned by foreign clothing companies use cheap local labor but are producing, 80% of all their exports are clothing exports, right? They're specialized in this area. Vietnam exports something like $70 billion a year in electronics. So they too, are starting to shift to a more kind of high-tech, kind of knowledge-based industry as well in recent years. Mexico, though, we can kind of linger on for a second here and talk about. Mexico, in 1994, entered into an agreement with the United States and Canada known as NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. And this is an agreement that expanded free trade between the countries of North America, Mexico, Canada, the United States. There's all kinds of parts of this deal, all right? But I really just kind of want to focus on one that is related to this idea of a globalized economy. The United States and Canada, through NAFTA, were permitted to build maquiladoras, basically factories, in Mexico, where they were able to take advantage of low wages, right? They were able to pay people Mexico wages. And all the things made in these factories could be exported back to Canada or back to the United States tariff-free, right? So you were able to outsource business to Mexico to take advantage of cheap labor. If you're a car company or you make televisions or something, you're getting some of the parts or whole things kind of put together in Mexico, and then tax-free, you get to send that back to the United States, right? So it's basically like these companies were able to open up factories in Mexico where only Mexicans were allowed to work for low wages. Now, the wages were low by Canadian and American standards, but they were usually slightly higher than other industrial kind of factory jobs that could be found in Mexico. Not monumentally higher, but you were better off working at one of these maquiladoras than you were at some other, not maquiladora style factory. Mexico would benefit from this arrangement by gaining jobs for their people, right? These jobs that were at wages that were better than the local jobs, as well as getting access to some of this industrial production if these companies ever pulled out or things like that. Critics of NAFTA argue, like the labor unions, American politicians, have complained of the loss of manufacturing jobs to Mexico, as well as how this situation kind of takes advantage of low wages and poor environmental regulations in Mexico to kind of exploit the system. Finally, we want to look at NAFTA again as this free trade agreement between the North American states. It's since been replaced by the USMCA, the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement, all right, which is just basically NAFTA 2.0. But NAFTA's not the only thing like that, right? There are all kinds of what are known as supranational organizations like OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which includes Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all the big oil producers that are banded together in this kind of cartel that is able to really manipulate the price of oil and oil production around the world. There are groups like Asian, funny enough, that are the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's kind of economic alliance similar to the European Union, which is also this sort of economic political partnership across Europe. The United Nations is a very global kind of international organization. Almost every country on the planet is a part of the United Nations. And it has all kinds of subsidiaries like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, which all work closely with it. But the big thing to see about these places is that they are not national organizations. They are controlled and organized by several countries working together, right? They are above national. And again, depending on how you feel about these subjects, that's either a good thing, a sign of a more unified, more integrated future, or it's a bad thing, right? It's a sign of a loss of sovereignty and an individual direction for a country. All right. So the big idea being that as these industrialized, wealthy countries shifted to knowledge and service-based economies, the industrial and manufacturing centers of those countries relocated to regions of cheap labor, like Bangladesh, Vietnam, or Mexico. Finally, we get to multinational corporations, all right? All this economic restructuring is in part owed to multinational corporations, okay? The first multinational corporations are centuries old, right? We talked about the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, which as joint stock companies were the earliest examples of multinational corporations. They were also the business means by which imperialist nations made their wealth, right? Exploiting the resources and labor of the colonized. Today's multinationals are able to legally incorporate in one country, right? Be created in one country, but make or sell goods in one or more countries. That's why they're called multinational or transnational, right? They're headquartered and organized in one spot, but they do business in a great many spots around the world. They're a great example of globalization because of that, right? That today these multinationals are employing the knowledge economy, the software engineers and software designers, computer engineers, computer designers, and so on, the marketing departments of some regions of the world, like let's say the United States or Canada or Europe. And they're also able to take advantage of low-wage workers abroad to manufacture products for cheap, as well as a global market to sell this stuff to. India is an example to free market supporters of how international trade and investment by foreign companies like multinational corporations can greatly benefit the well-being of a country, right? So India, following decolonization and their independence from Britain and their partition with Pakistan, was an area where, relative to their neighbors, you could find a large population of well-educated, English-speaking people that, as a workforce, helped propel India to become this information technology and software powerhouse, in part due to investments from other multinational companies like Microsoft or like Google that invested billions and billions of dollars and outsourced all kinds of software design and development jobs, not to mention the kind of back office jobs of call center, sort of answering phones or giving technical support and things like that. This massive influx of corporate wealth, of foreign goods, created a consumer-based economy, a lot like in China, right, which went from communist to consumer-based capitalism. India was never communist, but also did not have this kind of middle-class, consumer-based society. Today, they have one of the largest, or if not the largest, middle class in the world, with 350 million people considered to be in the middle classes. That's tens of millions more people than there are in the United States, right? Babies, teenagers, men, women, all together, still is, 320 something million. There's more people in the middle class in India than there are people in America. All right, so finally, that makes it sound like, well, that's great, right? Free markets are good. Economic liberalization is great. It made India an emerging superpower. What's the issue here? Well, there are all kinds of criticisms of these multinational corporations and of kind of economic globalization as we've seen it. One is that critics argue that multinational corporations lack kind of national identification and loyalty. That they, for example, have a hard time being loyal to one country or another, right? Apple, for example, is headquartered in the United States, but all of their most valuable products, like the iPhone or certain computers, are assembled in China, right? So who do they butter up to more, right? Who are they loyal to more? Both of those areas are essential parts of their business, and they've got to do their best to keep both governments happy, right? Cannot criticize China too strongly or things like that, right? So that's one criticism, is that these multinationals are multinational. They're not loyal to any one country. They are beyond one country. Related to that idea of loyalty is the question of the ethics and kind of standard practices of these multinationals, which is another point of criticism, that they are intentionally sort of relocating to places where they can take advantage of loose labor regulations, right? No minimum wage, child labor is allowed, no environmental regulations, people could work long hours, things like that. The ethics and standards on those kinds of things are illegal in for the United States or Europe, for example, where some of these multinational corporations are from. But when they go abroad, they don't follow those ethical or legal standards of their home country, right? They take advantage of the situation where they can find it. And people find fault with that. Another criticism is that the idea that they are exploiting the poverty of people, right? One argument goes that when China or when a multinational corporation like Apple or Nike or whoever opens up a business in Bangladesh, that those people are benefiting, right? That Bangladeshi person is getting money, they're getting a good job, they are getting some stability. Bangladesh got this factory and the infrastructure related to it. But the other idea here is that, multinational corporations aren't trying to spread this around. They are taking advantage of the poorest places in the world where wages are going to be the lowest, right? If the people are skilled enough to do the work and the lowest paid, that's going to be the ideal location for these companies, right? So again, it's not about paying people a good wage or making a good product. It's about making a profit a lot of the time. And this profit incentive is seen as one of the kind of criticisms of these multinational corporations that are richer than ever, right? And then finally, although there's probably more we could list, these multinational corporations get criticized for doing a lot of things to avoid paying taxes, right? Putting money into offshore bank accounts, making dummy corporations that they pay money to for consultations so that they can have a lower taxable income. There are all kinds of stories in the news recently about Amazon, for example, hardly paying any taxes, right? Being one of the most profitable companies in the United States, but hardly really paying any taxes. This is a look at the 100 largest or richest economies or organization in terms of kind of gross domestic product in the world. All the ones in the black color are countries. Everything in red is a corporation. And it shows you exactly the kind of wealth and power we're dealing with, right? When people freak out about business interests or the 1%, they're thinking of images like this, right? That Walmart might potentially be able to beat, Belgium in a war or something like that, right? That they might be able to put an army together and beat Norway because they're twice as wealthy as that country, right? So this is sort of where we will conclude it, all right? Hopefully that helps you. We'll look at a couple things when we're in class here together, but these are examples of the growth of a global economy and what that kind of restructuring looks like, what kinds of problems it led to in the places where these economic shifts happened, and who's kind of behind it in terms of these multinational corporations. All right, guys. Hope that helps. I will see you next week. Have a good one.